This is true. This is very true, except maybe for the newer versions of ChatGPT that has been released last week. There is a new version that has this explainable AI capabilities, which can show you also how it reached the result. But this doesn't mean that the explanation cannot be also made up. So it's an important area of work, this explainable AI, in order to make sure as well it's part of our way of dealing with this generated data, one of the ways. So I totally agree with this. It might struggle because, again, depending on your prompt, you could be trying to connect to different concepts that are completely unrelated, and you ask the chat bot to connect them. And then it will have a way of trying to explain how did it connect them. It might not make sense, but again, uh, I mean, that's your prompt.
Yeah.
So we'll try to convince you, basically.
Mm.
Again, as I mentioned, we have technologies right now that we are working with in order to minimize all of these irreliable or unreliable results from
Mm.
these kind of generated or generation bots.
Yeah.
So we have ways to deal with it, but totally agree. I totally agree with this remark about that.
Yeah, and I also read that last year, for instance, just to give you that, about 60% of all the content which was existing on LinkedIn, which I use a lot, was AI generated.
Yeah, no, I mean
Uh,
that's
that's
scary.
scary.
Uh,
that that's a bit scary, because then again, let's get into the ethics and bias, because that um uh, we ethics in AI, a must have. I believe it's a must have, or maybe a nice to have it at some point, in academic development and research. But what role do ethics play in the development and use of AI, particularly when we talk about research and academia? It is, you have certain standards. You have to be transparent, you have to be honest, you have to have a citation. There are really a hardcore discipline on how you do your research and how you actually write a paper itself. It's based on transparency and honesty. But what role does ethic play in development and use of AI? As you said, it's really, you also mentioned you use it yourself, you found it very efficient, and you got a lot to do. But there are not, as I can see, very hard line about how to use it ethically. We just recently getting AI Act in 2026 in Norway. We have GDPR, for instance. We have all these ethical approaches, but still there are a lot of confusion in that area.
I totally agree. I mean, ethics is a big issue, and it's a cornerstone of what we call responsible AI development. Um, we are now in the era of that we are not sure what's happening and
Mm,
what are the guidelines and what are the border lines and so on, which is actually as chaotic as it's as an environment. It's the golden age of people who want to use these algorithms and these kind of technologies because we don't have regulations, or at least, I mean, regulations that are taking this kind of technologies into account, mostly of older kind of regulations and GDPR and so on,
mm,
privacy and data regulations. So it is in the future, without doubt. In my perspective, there will be a lot of work and a lot of international agreements as well on an international level between countries as well, related
mm,
to ethical frameworks, related to advancements of AI, related to applications of AI, probably into the level of related to which data sets the AI will be trained on. We have a lot of issues. As I mentioned, we don't know many of the or most of the data that like ChatGPT, for example, got training upon.
mm,
Uh, Many of them could be copyright or copyrighted material, and it could be
mm,
copyright violations.
mm.
You mentioned Sura, for example, and if you say that I would like to generate a image like Van Gogh, for example,
Yeah.
it will generate something like that. Is that something that could be violations of ethical or copyright material? I don't know. I'm not an expert in cyber law, but I see there is a problem there.
I let me just elaborate on that. There's a tool called Suno. Suno is an Indian word for meaning listen, which is an AI generative for music, where you actually just write what kind of song you want to make, if it's a pop, if it's an Indian song or metal song, and you
I
write.
actually tried it.
You tried? Yeah, I found it quite interesting. Actually, I was kind of surprised. I was like, "Oh, I'm a good artist." It was.
Exactly. Like in a second, you are Hans Zimmer, you know?
It was. But then I got to know that much of the data they actually used to use the language model on and practice and training data was actually relevant from artists who original songs, and they got into a lawsuit, a big one. And as you said, that is also an issue. But back to what I was going to ask, you have DeepSeek, which just came out of nowhere. Well, 1/3 of the price, they managed to create something much better than OpenAI managed for years. And there are seemingly accusations that they use the data OpenAI used. So OpenAI is now legally saying, "Hey, you use our data," but OpenAI, as you mentioned, used all sort of content, which was not legally allowed, books and so on. So my question is that who owns the data actually? If AI is so dependent on the tools, on data, who gets the royalty? Now in the future, I'm talking, who has the right, who has the decision? Uh, because all the tech companies, as I see, they are using all the data as it was free because it's on internet, and since it's on internet, it's not illegal to use it. That's my perception. I might be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And again, it's the core of what I was discussing. I mean, it's from my point of view outrageous that, I mean, OpenAI is talking about DeepSeek, that they are using all of this
Yes.
space. I mean, also, we have big questions about your own data set, OpenAI. And I mean, if the data is on the internet, it doesn't mean it's not copyrighted. It doesn't mean that it's ethical to use someone's idea and elaborate on it and like relate it to yourself. So there are lots of big questions about that. And again, I think ethical frameworks have to
Mm.
be there in order to guide AI in the ways that makes AI more transparent, more fair, more aligned with the public good. So I think, again, we are in the golden age now, or the golden opportunity age, where you can do whatever you like. I think in the future, it will be a lot more regulated. So I think this is coming anyway, because we see the impact of that related, for example, as misinformation or hallucinations that we discussed, and we can discuss that in more detail. But again, there has to be a lot of ethical guidelines related to how the training is happening, which materials are used for training. This is for several reasons, not only ethical reasons, also
Mm.
for trust in the data sets that have been used in the training, because also the material you use for training impacts a lot the data you generate from these algorithms. So there are also some issues that we see now from the generations or the generated text or material in general that could be traced back to the type of training it got, or the
Mm.
material it see during the training, or the,
And
let's say, data.
what you're saying, it is a lot about the data. I read something called synthesized data, which many companies use now. Not they are not using actual data due to GDPR and other regulations, so they are making fake data based on to build train their AI, which quite amazingly works very well. But my question here is, because AI is based on past data for most of what we see, it has the occasion to mirror stereotypes or biases, as we're talking about, and are already present in much of what we sort of get the AI to present. And they unknowingly emphasize the stereotypes in classrooms, especially when you use it in students use it or professor might use it. Given that AI bias is a real concern these days, often originate from human data and is trained on and lead unfair outcome or prediction, as you also mentioned earlier. How can researchers design AI algorithm except from the synthesized data set, which I mentioned now? But are there other ways to be objective and fair? Uh,
Yeah, great question. I mean, one of the big issues, as you mentioned, with the generative AI, with AI in general, or with data analytics in general, is the
mm,
bias problem. We have several issues, as we mentioned, but one of them, big issue, is the bias.
mm,
Uh, Bias can be described in many ways, but if we make it a bit simpler, we can maybe say bias can be three main categories. What we call technical bias, which is
mm,
related to systematic errors in the algorithms or related to the training data, improper class underrepresentation, many
mm,
technical issues.
mm,
Uh, we have also what we call social bias, which is actually a reflection of the inherent prejudices that we find in the human decision making, which is basically reflected from the data set itself. So
mm,
basically, if you are looking at the data set of an organization that is hiring people, and this organization is hiring more men than women, for example, and you
mm,
develop an algorithm that is trained on this data set to be able to predict or to use it in the future hiring, whom do you think it will hire more? You know,
yeah.
so you as a practitioner also have to take care of the technical biases. You have to take
Mm,
care of the social biases that
mm,
unfortunately exist in the real world, but we have to curate it somehow during our training of data sets to make it more fair, more transparent, and so on. And also the combination of both. So we spoke about technical bias coming or stemming from these systems or algorithms, the
mm,
social biases stemming from our prejudices and reflected in our data sets, and also what we call socio technical bias, which is actually even more complex when we try to coexist together and then we get our biases into the table. So
uh,
we have to deal with all of that, definitely. So bias uh, has many ways how to deal with it, but one of the interesting technologies that we are working with now called RAG, or
mm,
retrieval augmented generation, which basically to try to minimize a lot of problems of these AI, generative AI algorithms, like, for example, bias
mm,
and others, by fine tuning the algorithms and making them being trained on your data sets and
mm,
try to test, does it really generate data that is reliable? Is it contextual? Is it factual? Does it
mm.
make sense? You know, so a lot of these issues we try to measure. So the problem basically is that or the solution, I mean, this RAG solution can help with minimizing bias and hallucinations and other issues.
Uh,
So fine tuning can help with that.
so fine tuning can definitely help with that. But let's elaborate on that in the next question, which is kind of interesting. We mentioned bias. There are real life example where AI, for instance, not mentioning any company, they made a tool for surveillance for law enforcement, and accidentally this surveillance system only caught black people or African people based on the statistic because they thought blackmail, okay, they are actually criminal, and it beeped all these. The second example I read about was also interesting, where you actually asking for a CEO, and it would generate male CEO, no female, eventually. And if you type in nurse, it will not. It will only give you nurse, female nurse, for instance, but not male nurse. So
Exactly.
so these examples are actually real life, just recently back from 2015, 2018, and the recent 2020. But as AI is increasingly used in decision making, we see it being slowly, gradually implemented in boardrooms, decision making. Norway, for instance, are using AI. Our old wealth is using it for deciding where to place the money, how much. But let us go into the field of healthcare or criminal justice, for instance. How can we ensure it makes ethical choices, given the examples I just gave you now from being biased? But how can we make, and you mentioned RAG, is RAG the only approach, or can we use common sense, which I feel that we're not using common sense enough, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes is common sense is not very common. So actually, uh, answering your question or your this observation is very complex because it is on many layers and many levels. You have to apply again ethical and let's say ethical framework somehow.
Mm.
Because you have ethical obligations when you are training the data sets. You have ethical obligations when you are choosing the sources of the data sets. You have ethical obligations on testing the algorithms. You have ethical obligations on which kind of result can I generate, which kind of results I should not generate. So you have a lot of obligations. So I think ethics has to be embedded in the AI in the future as we see it's coming more and more day-to-day kind of tool, then ethics will be a cornerstone. At the same time, I um, I mean, we have been doing this, by the way, for a long time. I mean, this ethical issue was there for a long time. Let me give you an example. So, if you are not an ethical issue, but let me give you an example of the problem of underrepresented classes. So, for example, let's assume you have a data set of a nuclear reactor.
Mm.
And the data set includes, let's say, 20 years of running data of sensor data from the nuclear reactor. Uh, and you have, let's say, in these 20 years, three incidents, which
Mm.
were not major, but critical incidents.
Mm.
And you want to create an algorithm based on
Mm.
your data
Mm.
so that is able to predict when things will go wrong. That's because that's what you care about. You are not
Mm.
care about when things are working fine. That's okay.
Yep.
You
That's
want to
okay.
predict when there will be something wrong.
Mm.
Usually, an algorithm trained on this specific data set, which has thousands of transactions when everything was fine, and very few transactions when everything was not fine or something was not fine, then it didn't really see enough to understand what does it mean when there's something wrong. It's
Yeah.
better in predicting when things are working fine.
Mm.
So we as people working with the data sets and building these models, we have to take care of this class imbalance that when things are going okay and things when they are going wrong, we have to somehow try to let the algorithm be trained and see enough events or observations from both cases in order to be as fair and as good as possible. Think
Possible.
about it again in the examples you have said about black males, white males, or whatever,
Yeah.
Africans, and so on. It's the same thing. So you are dealing with data sets that have some kind of potential bias, let's say,
Mm.
then the algorithms will have potential bias. So again, RAG and these kind of human judgment has to be there in all the different layers of developing these systems. So I don't think these systems can be developed from scratch alone, so far at least.
So far, Eddie. Okay, let's elaborate on that on the next question. Let's go into the global and economic impact. We've been hearing a lot about the AI race, as I observed, especially between US getting a 500 billion or when they released for the AI development, where many numerous prominent tech companies are now collaborating. And suddenly you have China doing the same. India is also coming afterwards doing the same with a lot of data. And both India and China have massive data compared to other countries. When we, with the US and China, often mentioned as fourth runners, what I've noticed, given the global landscape and the rapid pace of AI, where do you see the global leadership in AI innovation, evolving over the next decade? Will Let me elaborate on that so you can. Will it remain concentrated in, for instance, in China or US, or do you foresee other countries or regions emerging as major forces when it comes to this area?
Yeah, very difficult question, but very important question. I had a discussion with a friend of mine that works at Meta last week in Holland. We discussed that because AI has the potential to do both, depending on how it's implemented, basically, without basically deliberate policy interventions. There's a risk that AI could make the economic inequality even bigger, or the economic divide even bigger, by favoring those with access to the technology and with those who have the advanced skills and basically the education platforms that can generate people with these skills. On the other hand, if managed well, AI, including definitely generative AI, can be also a powerful tool for enabling economic growth and job creation and improve policies. Improve the quality of life, improve even policies. It can be used in many different types of improvements, but it will again require our international collaboration in order to make this fair. I mean, my friend, as I mentioned last week, we were discussing, he was imagining a very 1984 scenario, is that what if one country is controlling AI, and then with some kind of a button or a wheel, they are controlling the level of intelligence each country can use. So for example, let's give, I don't know, Norway 80% intelligent, let's give Egypt 40%, and so on. I mean, how far we will be from the rest of the world.
That's interesting. That's really.
On the other hand, we have a lot of open source also models and technologies that can help us to advance, especially for SMEs and so on. So there are lots of technologies out there, but again, we lack the knowledge, we lack the expertise, we lack enough people, we lack probably the resources as smaller countries, or smaller or poorer countries, let's say, or smaller organizations that have the expertise and the resources to use it. But again, at least the hope is that many of the technologies that are used in the infrastructures for these kind of technologies many of them are open source. Accessible, but this is
you mentioned very good points here, but I would like you to elaborate a bit more concrete, if you might. Who do you see like the major forces in the region? Like you mentioned small countries. For instance, I read that Norway, for instance, we are very good at research, but we still lack. We're at the bottom in the OECD countries, and among our Nordic countries like Sweden, Denmark, we are at the bottom when it comes to AI usage, like in innovation wise. Research wise, ethically, we are at the top. We know, what I read, but USA, China again are very on the front seat when it comes to developing AI tools and innovating, and they are pouring a lot of resources. Even Norway, for instance, the government said, okay, we will try to get up to 100% by 2030. But honestly, I don't see that very soon. We are only at 28 at this moment, and we are only 5 years ahead. And people are still, as you mentioned, trying to figure out what it is, what it can do. We are still in a limbo situation. And I see that countries like, for instance, USA will escalate, and China and India, for instance, that we will have a sort of a barrier, and Europe will be in between. That's my assumption. I might be wrong, but I would like you to elaborate on that idea.
Yeah, I agree, but take care. I mean, there are lots of other minor or minute details in the problem. So the problem is not only about the technology, it's not only about people who have the skills, it's not about accessing the data and the training alone. There are lots of issues related to the chips.
Mm.
In a small country like Taiwan is controlling a lot of the AI advancements in relation to the chip production. I mean, chips are very expensive, and the training of these algorithms are very expensive. I mean, DeepSeek has done a lot of work, at least
Mhm.
from what we read, in that in reducing the cost, but it doesn't mean that it's not still an expensive thing to do.
Mhm.
It needs massive power. It needs skills, as we mentioned. It needs a lot of other things, but definitely it needs technological parts, equipment, infrastructure, chips, and so on, GPUs, and so on, that enable this to happen. So there are many players, let's say, there. And my worry is if politics would shape the future of AI, then we have a big problem as a world, let's say.
Yeah.
So again, my hope
Mhm.
is the work that is happening in Norway about ethical AI and happening in different countries that we are working with in projects and so on, is
Mhm.
that they have to think about it globally.
Mhm.
It has to be agreements between countries. It should be something like the Paris climate agreement. I mean, it has to be something there that uh, is at least providing some guidelines, ethical guidelines, security
Mhm.
guidelines, different guidelines for how AI can be used, how it could be trained. And again, the problem is that there are lots of details there. There are infrastructures, there are
Mhm.
different layers, different processes. You have even the decision making part. And let me pick up something you mentioned. You mentioned Sweden is very advanced in that. Um,
Mhm.
Sweden have changed the constitution to be able to put a clause that says that a human can make a decision or a machine can make a decision.
Mhm.
I've read about this. I've worked in research related to that. I read a paper of one of my colleagues, Ragal, as well, discussing this specific topic, and they are saying that it's a bit scary because
Mhm.
it should be co-intelligence or collaborative, intelligence or rationality. So it has to be human, should be there in the formula still. Uh,
Mhm.
Especially if it takes decision making, and definitely depends on the type of criticality of decisions. I mean, it's not about a decision on a production line, different, definitely in a decision that should we fire a weapon or not, you know?
Yes, I agree on that, and that's quite
Yep.
scary on that level and interesting. But let's go in like the next one. Recent research by PwC suggests that the benefits about do not come to the expense of jobs, which you also mentioned that it might not be now, but we are at risk. McKinsey research sizes the long-term AI opportunity at $4.4 trillion in added productivity growth, but potentially from corporate use cases. So, in your view, is AI more likely to be a force of greater economic inequality? You mentioned a bit about it, but I would like you to elaborate on that. Or can we proactively shape its development and deployment to ensure it become a true engine for something good, like that? It should be everyone using AI. It should be not certain group for people, but everyone should use it for greater good.
Very good question. Again, I mean, I am a proponent or an advocate of ethical AI. I'm an advocate of democratizing AI. I mean, my view of the world is that it should be fair. Everyone should get the same kind of
Mm,
technology. They should be offered the same type of infrastructure. They should be. It should be as fair as possible. So my view, if this happens, it would
mhm,
create a lot of new markets. It would create a
mm,
lot of startups that we have seen already. Some of them are
mm,
very successful. And it, as I mentioned, a lot of the technologies, underlying technologies are available. Many of them are open source. So we can use existing systems in order to create more economic benefits. So I think it will make us more efficient in the future. It will enhance our efficiency and time consumption. So I think it will have an impact on definitely the economic growth of countries. But again, it depends on how it is controlled and how it's used in the future. So there
mm,
is this big fear if a small amount of countries are
Mhm.
controlling these technologies, the chips, the infrastructure needs, and so on, and the education definitely behind it as well. It will create inequalities, and then some countries could be behind. So,
So yeah, so you basically also answered the future of AI. The next question was that what excites you most and what concerns you. So basically, what your concern is about, we talked about bias, that there are certain politics or countries controlling infrastructure or the machine hardware or the data set, for instance, and the education level of people using AI, that they are not aware of what's actually going on. And then you mentioned the ethical aspect as well, which is also a concern. But what excites you most, if we see the positive side, because you also said you are positive about that, but what's the most positive thing about AI in the future?
I mean, the positive thing is specifically with this generative AI technologies and personal assistance and all of that. I mean, AI has the potential to change a lot of technologies and infrastructures and industries. Uh, you see how generative AI, or at least yeah, I mean, large language models and these kind of technologies used, for example, in Google Maps, how it changes Google Maps, how now easily you can speak to Google Maps and say, I would like to dine Indian food, for example, and then it looks up in this very difficult map and then generate some results for you based on that, or generate a 3D image based on some images it took and generate the whole 3D environment based on image generation capabilities. It is like changing a lot of industries. I think it can solve a lot of issues like poverty related, drug discovery related. I mean, because a lot of applications in a lot of different industries, from education to streaming financial services around the world, to a lot of different applications. So I think it's definitely going to change the landscape of different industries. Some maybe also jobs probably will disappear. And again, I'm a bit worried about copyrights and so on. But would we need graphical designers in the future? Would we need, I mean, language checkers in the futures? Would we, or proofreaders?
Mm.
Probably we are not using them anymore now already in many cases. But would this job completely disappear? Or would we have also still some problems with copyrights when we generate images? So we will still need to rely on people. I don't know. Uh, so it is not very clear because, again, the technology is still not clear. And I have to tell you, by the way, I mean, Victor, is that in many cases we don't really understand why the algorithms are answering in this way.
Mm.
So I mean, there is a bit of a black box there as well in the behavior of these algorithms or models, that the results you get. There is an issue there as well, understanding how really do they behave. So we don't completely understand the technology as well. So it would take us time to get
I
hold
agree.
technology, to get hold of the regulations, the frameworks, and all of that in order to make sure that the future is more bright. But it has a lot of potential to address different technologies, different industries.
Good. I think we are at our time with that, people. It's been amazing. I could talk to Moutaz much more. I've known him for many years, and definitely we could make an own podcast about bias for its own, but that later. But as you all know, we talked about ethical aspect, we talked about the human nature, and we talked about mainly what Moutaz said about coexisting, which is essential core, which I would like you all to take away from this episode. We need to, as much as we using internet is essential for our existence, AI is here to stay. And as Moutaz also said, we don't quite know where it is at. We are exploring it. We are trying to figure out. We are in a stage of, okay, finding it. But we need to be reliant on it. We need to be critical. We need to focus on the ethical aspect. And seeing how the world is now becoming, it's more and more important that we are more agile, more focused, more determined, and educate us ourselves. That's all I have to say. Moutaz, do you agree on that? We should educate ourselves on these aspects and actually be more critical going forth.
Totally agree. We have to be critical on several levels, as we discussed, ethics wise, and many, many other issues. And also, we have to be curating the results of these algorithms. We have to use them with caution, but this doesn't mean that they are not impressive, and it doesn't mean that many of these problems might be reduced in the future, very near future, by the way. But still, I believe in the coexistence. I believe in the co-intelligence. I believe in the hybrid intelligence. So I'm a proponent of that, and I agree with all the people that are discussing that. And by the way, there is a very nice book about also the problem with noise, which one part of the problems, which is called basically noise. Book is a very nice read about the issues of noise in these kind of algorithms and in general. So I totally agree with you. It will reshape our future, but we have to be careful and we have to act, from my point of view, on a world kind of level agreement.
We need to be, we mean, yeah, I agree. We need to be more holistic, more approachable, and understand the aspects on the ethical going forth, even though we don't quite understand it. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I had a pleasure talking to Moutaz here, and it was amazing. We went through several various subjects, everything from the educational aspect, academic wise, understanding the ethical ones, the skill sets required, and the relevance. Talked about what might be the prediction of AI in the future, and again, the biased aspect and economic impact and the global impact AI is making. That's all for me. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for listening in and watching the show. I'm Victor Singh. Don't forget to tell your friends about us, like and share, and until the next time, take care.